Hello, everyone. My name is Keith Jackson. I'm a senior manager with Cherry Beckert, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all today. I'm really excited to provide you with a comprehensive overview of the HITRUST CSF framework. It's a topic that I'm really passionate about, and I hope that it's beneficial to you whether your organization has started the HITRUST process or not. Wanted to start just by giving a brief introduction of myself and my background. I've been working in the IT risk and compliance space, I guess, for the last 13 years or so, mostly in a professional services capacity or in a consulting firm capacity. I've been exposed to and worked with many different firms and industries over the course of those years. But primarily, my industry focus has been in healthcare, technology, and the financial services space. I've got tons of experience with HITRUST. I've been a certified CSF practitioner since 2017 and have been involved in more HITRUST assessments than I can keep count of. I also have the unique privilege of being able to be on both sides of the HITRUST CSF process. So I've been part of an assessor firm who has performed assessments on organizations that are seeking certification. And I've also been an assessed entity who has been seeking certification as well. So I've got some insights into both sides of that spectrum, and I look forward to sharing those insights with you throughout the presentation today. As a senior manager at Cherry Beckert, I am, I guess, the leader of the information I'm one of the leaders in the information assurance and cybersecurity service line. And specifically, my team, our bread and butter is in the cybersecurity advisory and third-party attestation services space. So on the slide that's in front of you on the left-hand side, you'll see some columns for that that describe the services that are in each of those. And we do everything from helping organizations establish or improve upon their IT and cybersecurity governance practices, to doing risk and vulnerability assessments, to things that are more technical in nature, like attack and penetration testing, and even serving as virtual chief information security officers. On the third-party attestation side, primarily a large portion of our work is SOC 1, SOC 2 reporting, and HITRUST assessments, which is what we're here to talk about today. But we also do a variety of attestation work across other different types of regulatory frameworks, such as all of the ramps, FedRAMP, State RAMP, Texas RAMP, NIST, CMMC, and others as well. We also have teams that are dedicated to IT cyber due diligence and IT managed services and managed security services as well. Cherry Beckert's got a talented team with a lot of experience that covers a broad spectrum within the IT security and compliance space. All right, so my goal today here in this presentation is to give you a comprehensive overview of HITRUST. And by the end of the presentation, there's a couple of things that I hope are takeaways for you. Number one is that you will be more knowledgeable about what HITRUST is and how it's designed, how it's structured, and also that you're more knowledgeable in determining if HITRUST is right for your organization or not. And if you have determined that it is right for your organization, that you're more familiar with the certification options that are available for your organization to pursue. And lastly, that I guess regardless of whether or not you choose to pursue certification, that you just have more insight into the very detailed and complicated minutia of the validated assessment lifecycle. So that's kind of what we're shooting for today. And we're going to start with the HITRUST overview. We're going to talk about what HITRUST is, how it's structured, really just setting the foundation for what HITRUST is. Before we do that, though, I think we've got our first polling question that is available now. And one thing that I will say, I think it was included in the chat as well, but this is a 2-hour presentation. So there will be a total of 8 polling questions that get presented. And so you will need to answer at least 6 of those to receive the 2 credit hours of CPE. And we'll leave each of these polling questions up for about a minute. So here's the first polling question. This will really help me as we move throughout the presentation to know what to focus more or less on. So what is your current familiarity with HITRUST? Options here, pretty simple. Either you know nothing about HITRUST, you know very little about HITRUST, or you know a lot about HITRUST. All right, so the results are in. Okay, so the majority, 61% of folks know nothing about HITRUST, 35% know very little about HITRUST. So in total, 96% fall into those 2 categories, which is great because that's exactly what this presentation is built for. It's for folks who fall into both of those categories. Those of you who know a lot about HITRUST, hopefully this will still be informative for you, and you can appreciate the things that we're going to be talking about throughout the presentation. So moving on here. So we're going to talk about what is HITRUST. So HITRUST was founded back in, I believe, 2007. It originally stood for an acronym for Health Information Trust Alliance. HITRUST was originally designed to focus on addressing growing concerns with protecting PHI, or what we would call protective health information. And so HITRUST was a healthcare specific framework that was intended to protect that type of data. But over the last several years, HITRUST has moved away from a healthcare specific focus and is really more industry agnostic. And it really just stands for HITRUST now. Health Information Trust Alliance is no longer used, and the organization just goes by HITRUST. And instead of seeking to protect PHI, they seek to safeguard sensitive information across all types of industries, not just PHI, but any type of information that an organization considers to be sensitive and require protection. Their framework is intended to protect that type of data. And so over the course of these 20-something years that HITRUST has been around, or almost 20 years, HITRUST has developed and maintained a widely adopted risk and compliance management framework that they call the HITRUST CSF, which stands for Common Security Framework. This framework, though, is also a certifiable framework. While there's many governing bodies out there or organizations that have put together frameworks, not all of them are certifiable. And so that's one of the unique attributes about the HITRUST CSF is that it is a certifiable framework in which organizations can demonstrate compliance with a pretty robust framework. And I think you'll see that as we go throughout the slides today. All right, so thinking about the framework, over the next several slides, we're going to talk about how this framework is designed and structured. First, we're going to talk about how it was originally built. So you'll see on the slide that it was originally built on the ISO 27001 and 27002 frameworks back in 2007. But over the last several years, that framework has really been expanded, and it includes dozens, and I mean dozens, of authoritative sources. And you'll see more about which authoritative sources specifically, but countless authoritative sources have been added to make it more robust, more well-rounded, more comprehensive. Some of those are on the screen, as you'll see there, ISO, NIST, PCI, GDPR, and there's some more as well that we'll go through as we progress through the slides. Another thing about the framework itself is it's a multi-layered framework. There's, in a sense, a hierarchy. And so at the top there, you'll see control categories. And as you work your way down to the bottom, which is requirement statements, it gets more granular as you work down. So it's more broad, and then it works granular as it goes down. But the most important aspect of the framework is what you see at the bottom, which are the requirement statements. And there's currently over 1,900 requirement statements that are part of the framework. And throughout the presentation, I'll use the term requirement statements. I'll use the word control. as I use those words, I'm going to use them synonymously. A requirement statement is a control is a requirement statement. So I may mix those up as we work our way through, but that's what's most important to you, because as an organization that's going through a HITRUST certification, what you're going to see are the requirement statements. These other aspects of the design and structure are going to be more behind the scenes. But kind of quickly, just kind of working through the structure here. At the highest level are control categories. These are just high-level categories that were initially based upon the ISO 27001, 27002 framework. So you can think of things like information security management program, access control, those types of control categories. As you work your way down, it gets more granular. So now there's control objectives. So if we pick on access control as an example, one of the control objectives of access control is authentication. And so authentication would be a control objective. As we work our way down from there, it gets more granular to control references. And these are more prescriptive in nature. So again, let's say we're at the access control category. We've got authentication as our control objective. A control reference might be password management, which is part of the authentication process. And then you've got the requirement statement itself. So an example of a requirement statement that may fall into the example of password management might be that passwords are not displayed when entered onto the screen. That might be the control requirement that you might see as part of that control reference. Another thing that I'll say here on this slide is the implementation levels for the design and structure. There are up to 3 different implementation levels based upon risk. So they're simply level 1, level 2, and level 3. The higher the risk of the control, the higher the implementation level. So 1, 2, or 3. All right. Continuing with the design and the structure of HITRUST is this idea of assessment domains. So every HITRUST assessment will include these 19 domains. These are essentially areas or domains in which an organization needs to be able to demonstrate some form of security or privacy maturity. And so you can see the different domains that are listed there, everything from information security protection to mobile device security, wireless security, password management, as we talked about, access control, risk management, physical and environmental security, and the like. But all 19 of these domains will be included in every HITRUST certification that you pursue, and there will be controls that are, or requirement statements that are within each of these domains. And the number and types of controls that are included in your assessment that fall in these domains will depend on a variety of factors that we'll talk about as we continue to progress through the presentation. But for now, just know that you will see and have to be in compliance with controls in all 19 of these domains. All right, so thinking about those requirement statements, again, these are the most important things that you will see as part of your assessment. They'll be in your face. You'll have to be in compliance with them. And so these are the expected controls that you are required to have in place to obtain a HITRUST certification. One thing that I wanted to point out is that second bullet around illustrative procedures. HITRUST provides illustrative procedures for every control. And these illustrative procedures are very important. They provide guidance from HITRUST to both the assessed entity and to the assessor firm on how these controls should be tested and what's actually required of them. Many times the control requirement language itself is pretty prescriptive, and it makes sense what needs to be in place. But those of you who have done HITRUST in the past, you know that buried within those illustrative procedures sometimes are things that are not very intuitive based upon reading the control language itself. And so as you prepare to pursue a certification or as you undergo a certification, make sure that you're really looking at those illustrative procedures. They help you understand what HITRUST is actually looking for each of those controls. But most importantly, it helps provide consistency in how your assessor firm how the assessor firm is going to test those illustrative procedures, because that's what HITRUST is expecting. Third bullet there, requirement statements will be in all 19 of those domains. So again, whichever type of certification you choose to pursue, you're going to have controls in all 19 of those assessment domains. And then the number of requirement statements that you have to comply with is going to vary based upon the type of certification that you're pursuing and potentially some scoping factors that we'll talk about here in the next few slides. All right, HITRUST maturity levels. So again, you will have to comply with a certain number of requirement statements or controls, and each of those requirement statements or controls will be assessed for up to 5 maturity levels. And these are those 5 maturity levels. So starting at the bottom, you've got policy, procedure, implemented, measured, and managed. And so we're going to talk through these real quick. So policy, to start off with, policy demonstrates that an organization knows what it needs to do. So using the example that I used a couple of slides ago about passwords are not displayed when entered, say that is the requirement statement, that the organization has a policy that essentially requires that stipulates that the organization will have its applications in such a way that passwords are not displayed when entered. So there's going to be a policy statement somewhere that defines that. Moving up from there is procedure. Procedure from a HITRUST perspective demonstrates that the organization knows how to do it. So here you can think of the who, what, why, how, and when. So who's responsible for ensuring this control is in place? How is it technically being done or implemented, enforced? When are they doing it? And things along those lines. So it's more granular in terms of the who's doing it, how they're doing it, when they're doing it, why they're doing it. As we move up from there, we've got the implemented. So not only is there policy and procedure that require and indicate how it's going to be done, but now is the organization actually doing it? So from an implemented perspective, evidence would be provided to demonstrate that passwords are not displayed when they're entered onto a screen. So the passwords are masked whenever you log into an application. Moving up from there, you've got measured. And this really demonstrates that an organization is continually evaluating the effectiveness of that control. So here, an organization would demonstrate that through some process on some defined frequency, they're going through their in-scope systems and making sure that they're configured in such a way that passwords are not displayed when entered. That would be what measured is. Up from there is managed. And that would be that the organization demonstrates that they're correcting problems whenever they find any. So if the organization finds an example of passwords not being displayed when entered, that they correct that. And so those are the 5 maturity levels that are applicable for controls. But depending on, again, what type of assessment you are pursuing and what assessment you are pursuing will determine which of those maturity levels that you have to comply with. And we'll talk more about that as we move through. Now, scoring. So as part of your assessment, you're going to have 19 domains. There's going to be controls assigned to those 19 domains, and those controls are going to be assessed. And as they're assessed and they're tested, there's going to be a score that gets assigned to the control. And so you'll see on the screen now that there's 3 grids of scoring. There's a maturity level scoring, a requirement statement scoring, and a domain level scoring. So we're going to talk through each of those individually. So the maturity level scoring. Every maturity level that's in scope for this control will be scored from 0% to 100%. So essentially, non-compliant to fully compliant in 25% increments. So as an example, that control that we used about passwords not being displayed when entered. So is there policy for that? If there's a policy statement that says that, it's going to get 100%. It's going to be fully compliant. If there's procedures that are documented that explain who's doing it, how they're doing it, when they're doing it, things along those lines, it's going to be fully compliant. If it's implemented, you can provide a screenshot showing that the application requires passwords to be masked, then it's going to be fully compliant. And so each of those maturity levels are going to receive that score, which are then ultimately going to be aggregated to give the total control a score. And that's the middle grid there. So each requirement statement will be scored. This particular scoring rubric that's shown on the screen, though, is for the R2 assessment. You'll see that over on the right-hand side, the R2. If you look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see that there's three different options there, an E1, I1, R2. Those are the three certification paths that the organization or that HITRUST allows for certification, E1, I1, R2. The scoring that you see in the middle is for the R2. So in the R2, you see those five maturity levels there: policy, procedure, implement, measured, and managed. This is how the overall score is comprised. 15% of the overall score of 100 is based on the policy. 20% for procedure, 40 for implement, 10 for measured, 15 for managed. One of the things about the R2 is that the only maturity levels that are required are policy, procedure, and implement. You don't have to do measured and managed. If you do, it's a bonus. If you don't, it's okay. And you'll see that if you add up policy, procedure, and implemented, your highest score possible for a control would be 75. Some of you may think that's a pretty low score. If you in school, if you get a 75 on something, that's not really a good grade. But in the world of HITRUST, that's actually a good score. As you'll see at the bottom there, each domain must maintain a minimum score. And if you look at the red box for R2, the minimum score is a 62. And so if you get a 75 out of 62, that is a good score. That is well above passing. And so that's why that minimum score is a 62. It's totally okay to do 75. Most organizations that we do HITRUST certifications for will only choose to test policy, procedure, and implement and obtain that score of 75. But all that to say, a control is going to be given its own score based upon how it scores for policy, procedure, implement, measured, and managed. Then the scores of the controls within a domain will also be aggregated. So let's just say one of those domains, password management, has 5 controls in it. Each of those controls are going to have a score. Those scores are averaged or aggregated to give a total domain level score. And this is the most important piece, that each domain must have a minimum score that's shown on the screen. So E1 and I1, both, each domain needs to have a 83%. So all 19 domains must have 83% or above for its score in order to achieve certification, whereas an R2 can get by with a 62. And from an E1 and I1 perspective, the only maturity level that is assessed is implement. So if you look back in the middle chart there, the implemented for an R2 is 40%, but an implemented for an E1 and I1 is 100% because that's all the score. That's the only maturity level that's in scope there. And so therefore, that's why the minimum domain score of 83 is a lot higher, because you're only being tested on one maturity level. So really kind of key takeaway here is that there's a variety of scores that are going on, and you need to be aware of those. For each control, the maturity levels are going to be scored, which is going to contribute to an overall control score. Those control scores are going to be aggregated across the domain to give you an overall domain score, and your overall domain scores need to be above those thresholds. And here's something that can happen. I've not seen it happen, thankfully, but this is what can happen. You have 19 domains. You could do really well on 18 of those 19 domains. You could get 100%, let's just say, on all of your controls and all of those domains. But if in one of those domains, your score for an R2 is a 61, you fail the assessment, even though you did great everywhere else. So that's something to be mindful of, especially as you work through an assessment. All right, moving on, HITRUST regulatory factors. So, you know, HITRUST originally was founded to be focused on the healthcare industry, to protect PHI. And so you can see here on the regulatory factors in the middle on the second row, that there's the HIPAA breach notification rule, HIPAA privacy rule, HIPAA security rule. So that makes sense. But you'll also see regulatory factors that are industry agnostic or that are across multiple industries. And that's because HITRUST, again, is moving away from a healthcare focused framework to an industry agnostic framework. It just seeks to protect sensitive data for all industries. And so here on these regulatory factors, you'll see some regulatory factors that are outside of healthcare. So privacy, for example, you'll see GDPR, CCPA, South Carolina Insurance Data Security Act, just a variety of privacy frameworks that are applicable to organizations even outside of healthcare. For organizations that are maybe retail or process credit cards, you'll see there on the bottom left, the PCI DSS framework is built into HITRUST as well. For those of you that may be part of the financial services industries, whether you're bank, insurance, something along those lines, you'll see top left, the FFIEC IS handbook, and over on the right, the New York DFS, Department of Financial Services 500, the NYCRR 500. And so there's also just a variety of just governmental or best practices standards, such as all the ramps, FedRAMP, State Ramp, Texas Ramp, NIST, both the CSF and their newly released AI risk management framework. And so these are just a sampling. These are the majority of the regulatory factors, but it's not inclusive of all the regulatory factors that exist within HITRUST. And that's one of the beauties of this framework, is that if you are subject to a lot of these other regulations, you can include them in the scope of your HITRUST assessment if you pursue the R2 certification and do what HITRUST likes to tout as test once, apply many. So instead of having separate audits for all of these different regulatory factors, you can combine them all into one and test it once. All right. So speaking of AI, the emergence of AI has prompted HITRUST to respond. Many of us probably know that AI has been around for a while, but many organizations are now beginning to adopt it and use it as part of its operations. And so therefore there needs to be some best practices and some controls and regulation around that. And so HITRUST is responding. And so one of the things that they have done is that they have added AI elements into their HITRUST CSF. One of the things we haven't talked about just yet is that there are different versions of the HITRUST CSF. They're constantly evolving it and enhancing it. And so every so often there are new incremental or major version releases that they put out. And so in version 11.2 and later, so beginning in 11.2 and every version that comes out after that, it will include the option to include AI elements as part of that. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But another thing that they have done is provided these two options for organizations. First is a AI risk management assessment. So you can actually assess yourself against leading standards in AI risk management. But also, you can get a certification now for your systems that are AI that you have deployed within your organization. I think it's time now for polling question number 2. Should be launched here soon. So polling question number 2 is, has your organization implemented AI? So either yes, no, or it's coming soon. See, there's a lot of questions in the chat. Let me look at these while you're answering the polling questions. Define E1, I1, and R2. That's a good question. That's coming up here in a few slides. So we'll definitely cover that in more detail. Just wanted to leave a breadcrumb there to get your mind thinking. How does the new PCI 4.0 framework help to mature HITRUST? So yeah, so that framework will also be included in HITRUST as well as regulatory factors such as PCI or HIPAA or anything else. As they release new versions, those ultimately get adopted into the HITRUST MyCSF or the HITRUST CSF framework as well. All right, looks like we answered the polling questions here. And has your organization implemented AI? The majority say no, but almost half say yes or it's coming soon, which is not surprising. Many organizations are beginning to adopt it and really figure out how they can adopt it and what ways it makes sense to adopt it, which really is a good segue into our next slide here. So one of the responses from HITRUST is the implementation of this AI risk management assessment. So here on the screen, you'll see a visual. I borrowed this from the HITRUST website, but essentially they're taking best practice standards, so ISO and the the NIST AI risk management framework, plus some of their own methodology as part of the HITRUST framework, and they're harmonizing all of that into their framework. And as a result of that, you can pursue a risk management assessment, AI risk management assessment. And so if you choose to do that, what it's going to do, it's going to prompt you with 51 requirement statements or 51 controls to assess yourself on. And again, these are based off of industry standards and best practices as it pertains to managing AI risk. And you'll be able to produce a report out of that that will show you areas of improvement. And so this risk management assessment can be done either by your own organization, so a self-assessment, or you can hire a HITRUST assessor firm to do it on your behalf. But either way, if your organization is, whether you've already implemented AI or not, this would be a good evaluation for your organization just to see how well you've thought through the risk pertaining to AI and how you're managing those currently. So it's a good opportunity to be able to do that from a good source such as HITRUST. The next thing that they've done is they've provided a certification. So this is a new certification that HITRUST just launched this month, and it's only for your deployed AI systems. And so what this will do is it'll give you an opportunity to be able to demonstrate that your organization has implemented leading best practices to manage risk pertaining to AI. And so you would do this by adding it on to a validated assessment. As far as I know, you can't just pursue this by itself. You have to add it on to either an E1, I1, or R2 assessment, which again, we'll talk about those in more detail here in a minute. But if you choose to go down this route, you'll be tested on 44 requirement statements. So there's 44 best practice controls as it pertains to managing AI risk that you will be assessed against. And unlike the risk assessment that we talked about on the last slide, to pursue this option, you will need an assessor firm to do this on your behalf, since it is a certification. One caveat here you'll see on the fourth bullet is that this certification is only available on version 11.4 and later. And so if you want to add this on to one of your assessments, you need to make sure that you are using 11.4 or later, or you won't be able to do that. All right, moving on here. All right, so we're going to now conclude the HITRUST overview section and the structure and design, but I wanted to leave you with some resources here. There's a QR code on the screen where you can get a free download of the HITRUST CSF. And it is a beast of a document. I think it's over 500 something pages. Overall, it's not very user-friendly, but it is detailed and lays out the entire framework, everything that we talked about in terms of that hierarchy and the requirement statements that make up the CSF framework. So you can get that for free by going to that website and downloading that. But one of the most helpful files that comes with that download is an Excel file that does a crosswalk or a mapping of the controls across all of those regulatory factors, NIST, PCI, all of the ramps, HIPAA, all of those regulatory factors that we looked at a few slides back, plus how they map to control categories, control reference, control objectives. And so you can see this comprehensive crosswalk across all of the structure, the design of the framework, which can be extremely helpful. One last comment for this slide. On the right-hand side, you will see that MyCSF is required for some things. So if you choose to do a readiness or a self-assessment, or if you choose to pursue a certification, any of the four that we've talked about, you will need to purchase a MyCSF subscription. You can't do that outside of that tool. And that tool is HITRUST own proprietary tool in which all of their assessments, self-assessments or validated assessments are performed. So you would have to purchase that. And we'll talk more about that as we move throughout the presentation. All right, so now we're going to transition into the second part of the presentation about why you should consider HITRUST certification. So is HITRUST right for you? And some things to be thinking about. Before we jump too far in, let's just really start by who are the key consumers of HITRUST. And so I think it's no surprise that you see healthcare on there, right? So 81% of U.S. hospitals and health systems, 83% of U.S. health plans are HITRUST certified. And I think that makes sense, right? Given the fact that HITRUST began as a healthcare industry focused regulatory or a framework, but it's gone industry agnostic over the years. And so now 75% of the Fortune 20 companies are using it and even more. And so what you'll see on there, you'll see technology companies such as AWS and Azure have began to adopt. Over on the far right, you'll see Pfizer, which is a financial services provider, technology provider, platform provider. They've also obtained HITRUST certification as well. So now more and more organizations outside of healthcare are beginning to be consumers of HITRUST. This again came from HITRUST website as well. On the left-hand side, you'll see which industries HITRUST says that it serves. So if you think about the industries that are pursuing HITRUST certification, you'll see higher education is pursuing HITRUST certification, manufacturing companies, retail companies, media companies. And so you can see that organizations, again, outside of healthcare. If one of the key things that I hope sticks with you as part of this presentation is that HITRUST is not just for healthcare. It's kind of been known as that over the years, for better or for worse, but it is not just for healthcare. It's industry agnostic. And as you saw on the slide where we talked about the regulatory factors, there's regulatory factors that are outside of healthcare and really are industry agnostic. And so so healthcare is not the only focus for HITRUST. All right, so let's talk about some benefits for HITRUST certification. So there's a handful here. I'll talk about, I guess, a couple of these in great detail, but I think first and foremost, third-party assurance is one of the benefits. Many organizations, to some degree, have to provide third-party assurance around their security and privacy programs to their customers or other third parties. And so HITRUST is definitely one way that you can do that. Another thing that I will say is differentiation, and I think this is a key one. HITRUST is a known name in many industries now outside of healthcare because it does offer a comprehensive and a pretty rigorous framework. And so a HITRUST certification signifies a strong security and privacy posture within an organization. And I can tell you many instances in which current clients of mine who have a HITRUST certification have mentioned that they have secured contracts with their customers because they were HITRUST certified, whereas their competitors were not. So it is a way to differentiate yourself from competitors in your space to have that certification. Another thing I'll say is awareness of maturity. So you can really get some insight into the maturity of your cyber and privacy program by undergoing a HITRUST certification. Because I will tell you that the HITRUST framework is very robust, it's comprehensive, and if you haven't undergone HITRUST before, I guarantee you going through a HITRUST certification will reveal some weaknesses in your cyber and privacy program. So this is a way to not only just kind of understand where your organization is from a maturity perspective, but to help you grow in your maturity as well. One final thing that I'll say on this slide, I guess, is a new development. Could lower cyber security insurance premiums. This is kind of new. HITRUST has recently announced a partnership with Triumph Cyber to offer a cybersecurity insurance product specifically for organizations that are HITRUST certified. So if you get a HITRUST certification, you can obtain your cybersecurity insurance from Triumph at a reduced price that is more competitive than where you could get it outside of that organization. So overall, I think kind of a big takeaway of benefit for HITRUST would be that certification can help you save money in the sense of lower cybersecurity insurance premiums, but also can help your organization earn money by getting more business, as being able to differentiate yourself and acquire more work with customers that do care about your privacy and security programs. All right, ready for polling question number 3 here. Which HITRUST benefit would be most impactful for your organization? So we talked about a handful on the previous slide. So here there's 3. So meeting third-party assurance obligations, which should be important, differentiating your organization from competitors, increasing your security posture, or lowering cyber insurance cost. All right, so opening up the Q&A here on the chat real quick. Let's see. Looks like, is it possible to obtain a copy of the framework without paying for it? Yes. So on that QR code, you can use that to download a PDF and an Excel format of aspects of the framework, but to actually look at it in a like a GUI format, like a web application in a user-friendly manner, the answer is no. You would need to pay for their MyCSF tool to do that. And we'll talk more about that here in just a minute. All right, so here the results are in. It looks like almost half are concerned with increasing your security posture as being one of the most impactful benefits to you. And then the other 3 are kind of spread equally amongst each other. So yeah, I agree. If you want to become aware of your security posture and to improve it, I think HITRUST certification would be a great opportunity to do that, because it is a very deep, robust framework. And there's going to be things that you're going to be tested upon that you would likely not think, and things that you probably don't already have in place that will ultimately help improve your security posture. All right, moving on now to is HITRUST right for my organization? So these are some things to consider, and the more that these things are important to you, the more likely it is that HITRUST is right for your organization. So one thing would just be, contractually speaking, do you have a contractual obligation with some of your existing customers to be in compliance with some industry-specific framework? And to be honest, most organizations do have this requirement. It doesn't necessarily specify that HITRUST be that industry framework, but nonetheless that you need to be in compliance or aligned with an industry framework. So HITRUST can help you do that. Number 2 would be to improve security and privacy posture. That was the benefit that was most impactful based on that last poll. And so again, this is a way to do that. But lastly, I would say compliance efficiency is one of the big reasons that HITRUST might be right for your organization as well. If your organization is subject to HIPAA, PCI, other types of privacy regulations, et cetera, the more boxes that you check on those regulatory factors, the more of a benefit HITRUST might be to you, because you can include all of those regulations and controls for all of those regulations into one assessment. You test once and you apply many. So it can be it can result in some cost savings, definitely some relational savings on behalf of your organization, and the folks who are process owners or control owners and are getting hit up all year long with audits. This would be a way to reduce the amount of the year that you are spending in audits, which could be a great thing, or is a great thing. All right, so now we're going to move into the available HITRUST certification options that are out there. So on this slide here, it's divided in half on the left and on the right. So on the left, you'll see a self-assessment. The self-assessment is not a certification, but we'll talk more about it here in just a minute. But on the right are the 3 certification options. That graph omits the new AI certification that we talked about a few slides ago because it's relatively new. But the certifications on the right are the 3 primary certifications that HITRUST offers. And so back in 2007, when HITRUST was founded, they only offered the R2 assessment. So you'll see that red circle over on the right. That R2, it's on an axis, right? On the vertical axis, you've got the level of assurance provided by the certification. On the horizontal axis, you've got the level of effort. So R2, it's a high level of effort, and therefore there's a high level of assurance that comes along with that certification. And that bar to go from non-HITRUST certification to an R2 certification is extremely high. And for years, many organizations attempted and failed to do that when they didn't adequately prepare. And so HITRUST heard that. And as a response to that, they came out with the I-1 and the E-1. The I-1 assessment came out in January of 2022, so almost 3 years ago. The E-1 assessment came out last January, so almost 2 years ago, to help organizations transition into a HITRUST certification. The level of effort for those certifications is lower, so therefore the level of assurance is as well, but they are a good entry point into HITRUST, and there's pros and cons for each that we're going to talk about here next. So first, let's talk about the self-assessment. I can't stress enough how important a self-assessment is. It truly is important to help set yourself up for success in obtaining a certification. And so there's a couple of benefits for that you'll see on the screen here. Number one is that you will be tested on the controls or the requirement statements that will be required for your certification. So you're in a sense doing a test run to make sure that you are prepared and that you cross your T's and dot your I's and you're ready to go when certification comes. Also, if there are some areas in which you're not compliant, which I can almost promise you, if you're not currently HITRUST certified now and you pursue HITRUST certification, you will see some gaps. And so this process will help you identify what those are and give you time to remediate those before you actually pursue the assessment. Another benefit is that it will give you the same look and feel as the certification process. It'll happen in that MyCSF tool that we've talked about. And so you'll be familiar with it. So you'll do this as a test run, and when the certification comes, you're going to be like a pro. You're gonna know exactly how to maneuver the CSF tool. You'll know exactly what to expect as you go along the certification process. One thing that I'll say here at this point is just the importance of using a HITRUST external assessor firm for your readiness, for your self-assessment. Some organizations will try to do this on their own, and they can do it with some reasonable success, but I've seen instances of organizations doing their own readiness and they're not fully versed in all that is HITRUST in terms of what constitutes proper policy and procedure and implementation, and they score themselves higher than they should have, such that whenever they go to pursue the certification, there's all kinds of gaps that they had no idea about. And so using a HITRUST external assessor firm from the get-go as part of your readiness will be very valuable to you because they know the ins and the outs of HITRUST, and they're going to help make sure your policy and procedure is up to par. They're going to make sure that from an implementation perspective, the right evidence can be provided and that the control is implemented sufficiently. And so I strongly encourage using a external assessor firm for your self-assessment. All right, so the certifications now, we're going to talk through each one. So we'll start with the E1 here. The E1 is really a baseline assessment. It is a good entry point into saying that you have a HITRUST certification. So the E1 stands for essentials. E stands for essentials, 1 stands for 1 year. So it is a 1-year certification. You'll have to pursue the certification every year if you want to maintain it. And the certification consists of 44 key cybersecurity controls. These are really just more foundational cybersecurity controls that really every organization should have in place. Another benefit of this certification is that it's only assessing the implementation maturity level. So you'll remember we talked about there's 5 maturity levels. This certification only tests implemented. You don't have to have thorough policy and procedure. You don't have to measure and manage. All you have to do is be able to demonstrate these controls are in place. So that being said, the level of effort to obtain the certification is low, and therefore the assurance provided is low as well. Again, there's only 44 controls. These are basic controls that every organization should have in place anyway. And we're only testing the implementation side of that. And so the level of assurance is low. But this could be a great certification for lower risk, low complex organizations, potentially startup organizations that have a third-party assurance requirement. And so you could obtain the certification probably with some ease and be able to demonstrate that you have good foundational cybersecurity hygiene. So it's a good entryway into the HITRUST certification space. It could also be a final destination. If you just have a low risk, low complex environment, your third party attestation needs are pretty minimal, this might be where you stop. You don't need to continue to advance through the different certifications. All right, moving on now to the I1. So for the I1, the bar here is a little higher. As you can see, instead of 44 controls, now there's 182 controls. So a big jump. Those controls are really just leading best practices. So the level of effort here is going to be moderate. It's going to be higher than the E1, but not as much as the R2 that we'll talk about here in a minute. So the level of assurance provided by this report is a little higher as well. The I stands for implemented because, again, you're only being tested on the implementation maturity level. You don't care about policy or procedure or measure to manage, only care about implementation. And the 1 stands for 1 year. So this is a 1-year certification. However, there is some good news on that. This is HITRUST has provided a way to help really kind of maximize this certification and what they call the rapid recertification. So in year 1, your first year pursuing the certification, you're going to be tested on the full 182 controls. If you score well on those controls, then you qualify for the rapid recertification. So in year 2, whenever you go to get this certification again, instead of testing all 182 controls, you now only test 60 of those controls. So it's about a third of the controls. So this could be good for organizations that have a pretty mature environment overall, and as a way to minimize the amount of testing that you're doing on the controls. So the certification, again, is good for really medium risk, medium complexity organizations that need to be able to provide third-party assurance over their security and privacy programs, and organizations that have a pretty mature environment already, because there are 182 controls to be compliant with. All right, lastly here, this is the Cadillac. This is the most prestigious certification that HITRUST provides. This is the R2 certification. R stands for risk-based, as you see there on the screen. 2, because it is a 2-year certification. All of the certifications we've talked about so far have been 1-year certifications. This is a 2-year certification. So the number of controls that are applicable for you in a R2 certification is based on scoping. So this is a risk-based. So there's a handful of scoping questions that you will have to answer that ultimately determine how complex and how risky your environment is. And based upon that, HITRUST will then determine which controls are in scope. Whereas in the other 2 assessments, those controls are already prescribed. If you pursue an E1, it's these 44 controls. If you pursue an I1, it's these 182. But the R2, is flexible based on the organization and their level of risk. Again, the certification is good for 2 years. What's a little different about this is in year 1, you'll test all of your controls. So let's just say based on your how you answer the scoping factors that you have to comply with 450 controls. In year 1, you'll test all 450 of those controls. In year 2, you'll undergo what HITRUST calls an interim assessment, and that's a much limited scope. You'll test at least 19 controls. Remember, there's 19 domains across the HITRUST framework, and so HITRUST will randomly select one control from each domain that will be tested as part of the interim process. And so you'll, at a minimum, need to do those 19. And in certain situations, if you have measured and measured scoring, then you'll have to test those again as well. But at a minimum, 19. And so because the scope of this assessment is much broader, it goes a whole lot deeper than the other certifications. There's a high level of effort and a high level of assurance that's provided by the certification. This certification would be good for organizations that are high risk, high complexity, that have third-party attestation requirements, where you need to be able to demonstrate that you have a mature security and privacy environment. And this probably is the final destination for you in HITRUST. One of the things that I will say here is what we've seen just over the last few years, especially as the E1 and the I1 certifications have been available, is that organizations are doing a progressive model. Well, they'll start with pursuing an E1. They'll get that under their belt, then they'll move towards an I1. They'll get that certification, and then they'll progress to an R2. So there's this progressive scale in which they're starting from the bottom and they're working their way up to the top with the R2 certification. And so that is a good option. Honestly, going from no HITRUST certification to an R2 is a huge bar, a huge hurdle to get over. It's definitely possible if you do the self-assessment, for sure. But if you want to take a conservative approach, you could go up the scale of certifications. Here on this next slide, we've got just a comparison of each of those certifications. So across the top, you've got the certification, starting with the least intrusive to the most intrusive, the E1, the I1, the R2, and down the columns there on the left, you'll see different aspects. So level of effort, level of assurance, cost, number of controls, etc. And so, as you might expect, as you progress right through the certifications, each of those metrics kind of increase from level of effort, from low to high. Assessment cost, it's going to cost more to do an R2 than it would an E1, because the number of controls is going to be higher for an R2 than any of the others, and the maturity levels, right? So E1, I1 implemented only. R2, you have to do policy, procedure, and implement if you even stand a chance at passing, but you could also add measure and managed as well if you wanted some cushion. One thing we haven't talked about yet, look at the assessment length. So to complete a HITRUST assessment for certification, it has to be completed within 90 days. And so you have 3 months to get it done. Most of the time, E1s can be completed in around 1 or 2 months. It really just depends upon how committed your organization is to providing the evidence and their availability to address follow-ups, as well as the assessor firm's availability to do the testing. But because the E1 is lower in terms of level of effort, it can get knocked out in a month or two. I1 generally is going to take about 2 months. It's kind of rare to knock that out in a month, but certainly in 2, less than the 3-month mark there. But the R2, you can pretty much bank on using that full 90-day period to get that assessment done, because the number of controls is really high. I think now with the newest versions of MyCSF, I mean, I think minimum 350, 300 controls is what you're looking at there. Yeah, so we've talked about the rest of that, but this is just a good way to compare each of those certifications across different criteria. All right, so now moving to polling question number 4. So, knowing your organization and your needs, and your current environment, which certification option do you think best suits your organization? E1, I1, R2, or none? I'm going to look at the chat here. Does each assessment look at 12 months like a SOC 2? That's a good question. The answer is no, it doesn't have to. So evidence for an assessment cannot exceed a year prior, so it has to be within the last year for sure. But technically, it only has to include a 90-day period. So your scope can be limited to just a 90-day period, but it could go from 90 days to up to a year. And so there's some flexibility in what that audit period looks like. So we've got the results in. The majority say NA. Okay, so almost 50% say NA. And then the next biggest category would be NE1. Yeah, that makes sense. I think even those of you that said NA, probably because you don't have a current requirement to maybe have compliance with a industry framework or specifically HITRUST, I think that it could be HITRUST could definitely still be beneficial for your organization as well for many of the reasons that we described in a previous slide. All right, let's move on now. All right, so now we're in the second or the last part of the presentation here. So at this point, we've basically helped give you an overview of what HITRUST is, how it's structured and designed. We've talked about things that you should consider as to whether or not HITRUST is applicable or would benefit your organization. We talked about the different certification options that are available in HITRUST. And so now where we're going to spend the remainder of our time for the next 50 minutes or so is doing a walkthrough of the validated assessment lifecycle. So at this point, we're going to assume that we've agreed upon the fact that we're going to pursue an R2 assessment. So that's the Cadillac, the most prestigious certification that HITRUST offers. And so now what we're going to do is walk through from beginning to end, maybe not at a 30,000-foot view, but maybe a 10,000-foot view of what to expect throughout that process. And so how we're going to do that is we're gonna talk through it in this way. So there's many ways that you could slice and dice this assessment lifecycle. I've chosen to keep it simple with just these 5 steps. First, select an external assessor firm. So to obtain certification, you have to use one of HITRUST external assessor firms to do that. Then, once you've done that, you'll have to purchase MyCSF, which is the tool in which all certifications are processed through, and then create that assessment object. So we're going to go through a mock of creating an assessment object together. Once you do that, then you're going to complete the assessment process. So this is that 90-day window in which all of the testing is being performed. We're going to kind of walk through that and what to expect in that part of the process. Once that's done, it goes to HITRUST. HITRUST will do a QA process, and we'll talk about the ins and outs and what to expect as part of that. And then lastly, we'll finish with the reporting process. So as a result of going through this certification, you will receive a report and give you an idea of kind of what that entails and what that looks like. So we're going to start with selecting the external assessor. So again, if you want to pursue a certification, you have to use one of HITRUST external assessor firms. And so what I wanted to do is kind of give you an idea of what those external assessor firms have to go through. And so HITRUST puts assessor firms and their employees, which we're going to call assessors for this purpose, through a screening process to make sure that they are competent and qualified to be able to do that. So on the external assessor firm side of the house, you'll see that these organizations, these firms like Cherry Bekaert, have to have formally documented policies and procedures for managing personnel and how they will do or perform audit services. So they need to have that part of the house in order. Not only that, but they've got to have qualified people. And so HITRUST requires these firms to have at least 5 certified CSF practitioners on staff to make sure that there's depth, that there's multiple individuals that are involved in these assessments. But then they also require that an organization have at least 2 what they call HITRUST quality professionals. And so these are individuals within the assessor firm that are responsible for making sure that the quality of the testing, the scoping, everything as part of the assessment is done in accordance with HITRUST standards. And so at a minimum, there needs to be 7 HITRUST certified individuals within that organization. Then for every assessment, at least 50% of the assessment has to be performed by folks who have the CCSFP, that Certified CSF Practitioner certification, to make sure that it is done with the highest quality. And then lastly there, that the validated assessment must undergo a rigorous internal QA review before it even gets passed over to HITRUST. So HITRUST puts a lot of responsibility on these firms to make sure that they're doing it the right way, the HITRUST way, and in accordance with their standards. On the assessor side of the house, every assessor, so these would be individuals like myself who work for an assessor firm like Cherry Bekaert, has to undergo a professional background check from HITRUST, a background review. They must meet minimum experience requirements. They can't just be brand new to IT audit and IT security, but need to be able to demonstrate that they've got sufficient experience to be able to do this line of work. They have to pass that exam, like I mentioned, the CCSFP, but not only do they need to do it once, they have to do it every 3 years to make sure that they stay up to date on all of the changes within HITRUST. And then in those interim years, in year 2 and 3, we have to do a refresher training and pass an exam to make sure that we, again, are up to date on the latest and greatest there. All right, so moving on now, what's more important for you is choosing an external assessor firm. So I wanted to leave you with some criteria that you can use to evaluate assessor firms whenever you're ready to do that. And these are things that I think are really important. So I think as you interview and interact with these assessor firms, you ask these questions. So how long has the firm been an assessor firm? Many organizations want to become HITRUST assessors. And so firms are trying to jump on board and be able to do that. But you want an organization that's been around for a while, an organization that's experienced in HITRUST. And so using a brand new external assessor firm is probably not the wisest choice. Not to say that they can't be a good assessor firm, but those who are more experienced are obviously of more value. So I would ask that. I would also ask how many certified, HITRUST certified employees that they have. HITRUST requires, again, a minimum of 5 CCSFPs, 2 CHQPs, but organizations that have more demonstrate the fact that they have a pretty robust practice. They've got a lot of experience, and they're dedicated to serving their customers with HITRUST certification. So the more certified individuals they have, the longer they've been around, the more experience they likely have, because it's not cheap to have all of these certifications. Also, how many assessments has the firm completed? I think that's a fair question to ask. Again, you want a firm that has experience. Kind of going along with that, how many assessments have resulted in certification? At Cherry Bekaert, we've got a great track record of helping our organizations achieve certification. Not all firms can say that. And so I think that's a valid question to ask, as is the next one. How many assessments have undergone the HITRUST escalated QA process? HITRUST will QA every assessment that comes through, again, to make sure that it's done up to their standards. But whenever they encounter a situation in which the quality is lacking, they will put that in what they call the escalated QA process. And that is not a place that any assessor firm or assessed entity, an entity who's pursuing a HITRUST certification, wants to be. So you want to ask, how many times have you gone through the HITRUST escalated QA process? Because that may be indicative of the quality of the work that they will put forth. And you want someone who's going to give quality work to HITRUST. And then also the firm's industry focus. So, you may be a healthcare specific organization, so you may want to choose a firm that is that has a particular focus on healthcare. And so that may be something you want to consider. There's a QR code there at the bottom. If you click on, or if you scan that QR code, or you can just go to their website, they list all of the external assessor firms on their website. And there's also an opportunity for you to connect with those firms as well through their website. Over on the right, I'll just make this caveat, which I think goes without saying, though. All assessor firms are not created equal. So you're going to want an assessor firm that's got expertise, that understands the HITRUST assessment methodology, really the ins and the outs, especially when it comes to QA, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. And then also a firm that's competitive on pricing. And so these are all things that you should consider when determining a HITRUST assessor firm. All right, polling question number 5. So based on all of that criteria that we just talked about, which of those criteria are most important to you if your organization were to evaluate an external assessor firm? So experience, industry focus, assessment methodology, the number of certified assessors, or the fees to complete the assessment. All good considerations for sure. Looks like there's no new questions in the chat. If you have any questions along the way, feel free to put those in the chat or the QA feature. So we'll leave this open for, okay, we just closed it. All right, so yeah, the results here are good. Experience was the leading answer here at 50%. Absolutely. Industry focus following, and then fees kind of coming in under that. So yeah, it's one of those things, you get what you pay for, right? If you hire an assessor firm for a very low fee, they're likely going to lack in the experience that you need to achieve certification, and that can backfire. HITRUST is not cheap. So whenever you pursue a HITRUST certification, you will pay HITRUST to obtain the certification, then you'll pay the assessor firm, and you're paying both of these parties to obtain the certification that you could ultimately fail. And so if you hire the cheapest firm that doesn't have good experience, they'll take your money, they'll do the assessment, and you won't get the certification, and you're out a lot of money and having to do it again. So I definitely wouldn't do service fee as the primary factor. I would certainly go with experience, because that's going to be the deal breaker between whether or not you get a certification or not. All right, so moving along in the process here, now that we've selected an assessor firm, hopefully Cherry Bekaert, we're going to move forward and create the assessment object here. Before we do that, one of the first things that you'll have to do to create this assessment object is buy a MyCSF license. HITRUST provides 2 options for that. Number 1 is the report only method, or option 2 is the subscription method. And so you'll see some pros and cons of those here. So length of access, report only, you only get it for that 90-day window that you're being tested. Once that 90-day window expires, you lose visibility into that. So all of your evidence that's out there, the reporting that's out there, all of it is just gone. You don't have access to it anymore. Whereas if you do a subscription model, you maintain that for as long as you pay the subscription. Also, another key factor here is functionality. So look down there. So number of users, control inheritance, that's probably the biggest one. Many organizations, especially nowadays, use other third-party organizations such as Azure, AWS, or other service providers that are executing controls on your behalf. And here's the thing with HITRUST. Even though, say, Azure is hosting your system and is providing certain security controls around that system, you are still responsible for demonstrating that those controls are in place, even though Azure is doing it. And so in order to do that, you have one of 2 options. Number 1, you can ask Azure to provide you with some documentation to show that they're doing that, which their answer to you is going to be no, or here's our SOC report, or we have HITRUST, you should go inherit our controls. Or option two is you purchase the subscription so that you can inherit their controls. And so really what that is you have a control that you're required to adhere to, and you're going to score it, which will make sense here in a minute once we get there. But if Azure is responsible for this control, you can just say, I'm going to inherit this from Azure, and you inherit their scores. So if they got 100 in policy procedure implement, so do you. You're inheriting their scores. We've seen some issues with, if you don't inherit, you're really limited to a SOC report or some other third-party compliance report to demonstrate that these third parties are satisfying the control. And HITRUST is getting really picky about what they will accept, because those of us who are familiar with SOC reports know that while they're good for the controls that are presented in the SOC report, they're not very comprehensive. Like, there's not hundreds of controls that are tested as part of a SOC. There's usually less than 100, right? So the HITRUST controls that you're going to be required to be compliant with are going to be prescriptive. If that SOC report is not prescriptive enough to cover the control, you've got a gap in demonstrating compliance. So the control inheritance feature is worth the subscription model. And so the subscription model is a little pricey compared to report only. Report only, I think, runs between $3 and $7 grand, I believe, depending on whether you're doing the E1, I1, or R2. And the subscriptions start around, I think, 17,000 and go up to 60,000, depending on and that's per year, all of the bells and whistles that you want to include. And so that pricing is subject to change, which is why I didn't put anything like that in the slide, but just know it is a little pricey, but it is worth it, especially if you need the R2 and you need to be able to inherit controls from a third-party service provider. It's going to be really important for you. All right, so moving on. So you've bought your MyCSF subscription. Now what you're going to do is you're going to create the assessment object in MyCSF. The assessment object is essentially your audit. This is the E1, the I1, the R2 assessment that you are undergoing. And so in this step, you're going to be entering a bunch of information about your organization, and then you're going to generate the assessment. And this is pretty quick to do. It doesn't take a lot of time. But one thing I want to point out is that QR code on the right. Make sure you go ahead and scan that and bookmark that website that it's going to take you to, because this is guidance from HITRUST on answering the scoping questions. Most of the scoping questions are pretty straightforward. Some of them not so much. And this this website will help you answer those questions. So let's get into those questions. So what I wanted to do is just give you a feel of what it looks like in MyCSF and the types of questions that you're going to be asked. So this is the Cherry Bekaert demo instance of MyCSF. Your instance will look very similar to this if you subscribe to HITRUST MyCSF. And so over on the right-hand side, you'll see there's a pane with different options: name and security, admin and scoping, reservation, and assessment. So this is that first part of creating the assessment object, and we're going to quickly run through that. So on this screen here, you're going to name the assessment. You're going to select who your assessor firm is. That drop-down will open up, and you'll see all of the available external assessors as options. And once you select them, at the bottom of the screen, I cut it off for people just to hide the identities of people, but you will see every assessor that's part of that firm that you can grant access to your assessment. You'll also see all of your organization's users that you've decided to create within MyCSF, and you can give them access to your environment as well on this screen. Then we've got the assessment options here. And so here, what you're going to do is you're going to select the type of assessment that you're doing, whether it's a readiness or a validated, and whether it's a I1, an E1, or an R2. So you're going to select that, tell them whether or not you're pursuing HITRUST certification as part of this or not, yeah, answering those questions there. On this screen here, so we're assuming from this point forward that we're pursuing an R2. So you'll see CSF version. So you will be presented with a box to select which version you want to pursue. And there will be a handful of those. There'll be 5 or more available versions for you to choose from, and you just need to work with your assessor to make sure that you're selecting the one that's most adequate for your needs. But you'll select that, and yeah, and move on from there. Those other questions aren't that important. All right, organization information now. So here on this screen, you're going to provide some important information about your organization. You're going to do the company background, so who your organization is, what your services that you offer to your customer base are, and then you're also going to describe your security organization. And so what you will currently see in both of those boxes is HITRUST or our HITRUST instructions on the types of information to include in those boxes. And so that's really important for two reasons. Number one, what you put in those boxes will go on your report, and you're going to end up giving your report to other organizations as part of your third-party attestation requirements. And so you want to make sure that what you put in there, you're comfortable sharing with organizations outside of your organization. But then number two, HITRUST will scrutinize this. They will look this over and ask questions about it, especially if you don't meet the requirements that they put in there. So just make sure that you give that the attention that it deserves to save yourself some heartache. Moving on from there, what you're going to put in this section is the contact information of the key person from your organization that's kind of overseeing this. This will be the individual that HITRUST communicates with. Primarily, this will be the individual that your assessor firm is going to communicate with as well. So you'll put their information there, as well as the your organization's mailing address. All right, the scope of the assessment. This is one of the most important fields in here as well. This is where you will say what is and what is not in scope. So HITRUST certifies systems. They don't certify organizations. Some organizations will say, yes, we are HITRUST certified. And while that's partially true, it's not totally true. Like their organization is not certified by HITRUST. Systems in their organization is certified by HITRUST. And this is where you define which systems are certified. And that's one of the good things about HITRUST is you as the organization pursuing certification have the ability to define the scope. You get to pick which systems are going to be in scope, and it's those systems that are subject to all of the controls that result from completing this process. And so with that said, if you look over to the far right, you have the ability to exclude certain systems from scope as well. Or parts of the system. So if you have a particular platform that you want to certify because you have some third-party attestation needs for that, there may be an aspect of that system that is unique in such a way that you want to scope that out. You can do that. You can add that here, but you have to explain why. And so this is an area where you want to work with your assessor to make sure that this is done correctly, because HITRUST will scrutinize this and make sure that the scope seems reasonable and that any exclusions are also reasonable as well. So for example, if you scope out a portion of the platform that a handful of the controls in the assessment can't be tested because you've eliminated part of that platform out of scope, then they're likely going to kick back and reject that. So there's definitely some strategy that needs to go into this, but you have the flexibility to define scope, which is a great thing. Moving on to the next slide, this is where you'll list the facilities that are in scope. So really, those systems that we previously defined, where do those systems live? Most of the time, this is going to be limited to a data center, whether it be a colo like an Azure or AWS, or whether it's an on-prem data center at various facilities that you may have. But this is where you'll put the locations in which that data, those systems that are being certified actually reside. All right. Lastly, for setting the scope here, you'll have to identify which services or identify key services for your in-scope environment that are outsourced. And so here again, most commonly, it's going to be data center hosting, like an Azure or AWS, or it could also be some key service providers like an MSSP or something along those lines. But any outsourced um, service providers that you use that operate or manage controls for those systems need to be identified here and included as part of the assessment. All right, polling question number 6 now. Does your organization have a clear understanding of the scope for your HITRUST assessment? So if you're currently pursuing a HITRUST assessment, if you're about to pursue a HITRUST assessment, you're considering it, do you feel like your organization has a good understanding of what that scope needs to be? Which systems, which part of the systems need to be included in that assessment? All right, so 48% say NA, which I think that makes sense based upon one of the previous questions. But those of you that I guess are pursuing or will be pursuing HITRUST, it's almost split half and half between yes and no. And so I would kind of expect that. There's a lot that can be done with scoping, and I think that's where choosing an assessor firm that that has experience in doing that and helping set the scope is going to be really important. You want to make sure that the scope is set right. That'll even help the level of effort, the amount of testing that gets done. The scoping can be done in such a way that we really minimize the level of testing there to the degree that we can. So scoping is very important. All right, moving on here. So still setting up the assessment object. And now we get to this screen of default scoring profile. So this is one of the benefits of HITRUST, just from a usability perspective, that you can set a default scoring profile. So after we complete this scoping exercise, it's going to produce all of your controls. And there may be, again, 300, 400, 500 plus, depending on how many regulatory factors that you add. And so you're going to have to manually go in and score each of these controls. So this can help cut down on that manual time by saying, you know what, we know that we're going to just do policy, procedure, and implement, and we have a good feel for our organization, and we're just going to go ahead and say that they're 100%. So you can set it up that way and click save and continue. And so then every control will automatically be scored with 100, 100, 100. And that saves you a lot of time from going through and doing that yourself manually. All right, but here we go. So this is the most important piece of the setting up the assessment. These are the scoping factors. How you answer these questions will determine how many and which controls are in scope for your assessment. So there's general factors that you'll see at the top. So this is, what type of organization are you? So you'll select that. You'll select which entity type you are. So there's a drop down with a variety of options there, what type of entity you are. For this example, I said we're a physician practice and we're a healthcare covered entity. But then there's organizational factors. How many number of records are currently held? This is one of the key drivers to the number of controls. You'll open that box up and there's, I think, 3 options. The more records you have, the more controls you will have. And so that's just something to keep in mind. That can also play into scoping. You scope in such a way that you lower the number of records that are in scope. There's a variety of ways that you can play with that, but just know that the more records, the more controls. Then geographical factors. So are you just in one state, multi-state, or are you nationwide, outside of the U.S.? What is your footprint geographically speaking? And that'll trigger certain controls based upon what type of organization you are. All right, so then technical factors. So these are just technical questions about the environment. And so as you answer all of these questions, keep in mind the scope, the systems that you defined as being in scope. That's what you're answering to, not your organization as a whole, but specifically to this organization or to those systems. So technical factors such as, is the system accessible from the internet? Is it cloud-based or is it on-prem? Do you exchange data with third parties with the system? Is it publicly positioned or is it put in a place where the public can have physical access to your system. And notice on that question over to the right, well, first I said no. I answered no. Any question that you answer no to, you have to provide a rationale as to why the answer is no. And so you just want to make sure that you work with your assessor firm to provide a sufficient justification, because HITRUST will review every no answer and make sure that their curiosity is satisfied with why that's no. So that's going to be an important thing for you to consider for some of these. Number of interfaces, all of those things definitely contribute to the complexity and both the risk. Moving on now, so number of users in those systems, number of transactions that occur per day. So again, for all of these numbers-based questions, the higher the number, the more the controls that are going to be in scope for you. And so you'll see again, just a variety of questions, some yes, no, some answering a range of a numerical value. And again, anytime you answer no, you just need to make sure that you provide a sufficient justification for why it's no, because HITRUST will scrutinize those. All right. Again, more technical factors here, everything from use of hardware tokens to BYOD to wireless access points. Just again, a way for HITRUST to understand the complexity and the scope of your environment, of the environment that's in scope for the organization. All right, technical factors. Last questions here. These are the final questions. What does that say? Yeah, if you're using it as more of an e-commerce to sell goods or services, if there's electronic signatures, and if you're still using mail services, physical mail services, answering that, as that'll trigger additional controls based on how you answer that question. But once you've gone through and you've selected all of the technical factors, the last thing you'll be presented with are these compliance factors. And this corresponds to all of those regulatory factors we looked at in that grid at the beginning. So if this is where, if you're subject to HIPAA, if you're subject to PCI, if you're subject to any of these privacy regulations, if you want to include the NIST AI risk management framework, whatever it may be, this is your option to check those and include those in your assessment. The only caveat that I will place here is, and I think this makes sense, is the more of these boxes that you check, the more controls that will be included in your assessment. So without any regulatory factors, you may have 300-400 controls. If you include these regulatory factors, you might jump up to 800. But again, I think that's okay if your intent is to test once, apply many. That's what you want. You test all 800 of these now, and you're not testing some of those other controls later through other audits. All right, polling question number 7. Could your organization benefit by including one or more of those compliance factors into your organization? So answers are pretty obvious here. Yes, no, or not applicable. Closed. So very consistent responses here. Almost half say NA. Those of you who are pursuing or considering pursuing HITRUST say overwhelmingly, almost half say that yes, your organization could benefit from that. And I agree. I mean, we see many organizations adopt this approach, which again is one of the many benefits of choosing HITRUST over any other type of industry framework or third-party assurance platform. So, all right, continuing on, we're still setting up the assessment object here, nearing the end. One of the final things that you'll do is go ahead and select your QA reservation. So every audit or every assessment has to, let me say it this way, every certification, a self-assessment doesn't go through QA, but any of the 3 certifications, all of them go through QA. And so HITRUST has improved its capabilities by allowing you to now schedule QA. Back when HITRUST first began, it could take 4, 5, 6 months to get a QA, to get the QA process going. Now you can schedule it. So one thing to keep in mind is that you have 90 days to complete the assessment. So you want to make sure that your QA reservation is after that 90 days. You don't want to cut into your 90 days. You want to make sure you have all 90 of those days to get the assessment done. So make sure that the QA block is sufficiently outside of that 90-day window. All right, continuing on in the process here, we've selected assessor, we've created the assessment object. Now it's the fun part. It's completing the assessment process. This is the most time-consuming part of the process. There's several tasks to complete, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Over on the right, I kind of gave you a feel for how long this part takes. For E1, I1, you can do it in 1 to 2 months, most likely. But the R2, again, you want to make sure you allow 90 days to be able to do that. So here's all of the different steps that fall into this part of the process. You're going to collect evidence. You, as the assessed entity, are going to provide evidence to all of those controls. You're going to score those, and us as the assessor firm will come in and validate your scoring. If you say you've got 100 in policy, procedure, and implement, we're going to review that evidence and make sure we come to that same conclusion and validate the scoring. There's most likely going to be follow-ups, as it is with every audit process. So there's going to be some time needed for that. Maybe there will need to be some time allotted for CAPs, which are corrective action plans. We'll talk more about that here in a minute. And then at the end, there's just a variety of admin tasks that need to be performed. And so we got to make sure that all of those get addressed. So we're going to start with the scoring and validation screen. Or the scoring and validation process. So after you get the assessment created, and the left-hand side, you can click on assessment and it'll give you an overview of your assessment. In this case, I'm showing you that the assessment is 100% complete. You can see that in the upper right. It says 100% complete. All 249 controls have been scored and validated. So after you create the assessment, again, we're going to exchange evidence. You're going to provide evidence to the tool for us to be able to evaluate. You're going to already score. Hopefully you use that default scoring profile to say 100, 100, 100, or whatever it is, and you've input your scores in there. And then it's going to come to the assessor firm to review and to validate, and we're going to validate the scoring. And you can track progress from a dashboard level along the way. So this screen, upper right, you can see the percent complete. But even down below under the assessment domains, I've left 3 in the screenshot, domains 1, 2, and 3. And you can see out there that they're in a status of complete with a number beside them. That number corresponds to how many controls are in that domain. So 18 for information protection, 5 for endpoint protection, 3 for portable media security, and so on and so forth. All right. So this is what it looks like at the control level. So this is the first control in domain 1. You'll see what the control is there, that the organization has a formal information protection program based upon an accepted industry framework that is reviewed and updated as needed. And so you as an organization over to the right will go in and score policy, procedure, implement, measured, and managed. And so you'll see I currently have 50, 50, 50, 0, 0. And so that's the organization scoring. So you'll see underneath the managed scoring box, it says response status complete, meaning the scoring has been entered and saved, and the compliance status is a gap, right? So because it's only 50% for policy, procedure, and implement, there's a gap there. So it'll show you the gap status. But as you go through a domain and you score all of the controls, in that green bar that's kind of going across the middle, it'll say, since you have entered values for all of the statements, you can now submit this domain to your assessor. So you're going to score all of these, and then you're going to click that hyperlink to submit it to the assessor. And then it's going to come over to us for us to then go in and see how you've scored and all of the evidence that's available for that control. Moving on now, this is an example of what inheritance looks like. So here's a control here on the screen that says user security roles and responsibilities are clearly defined and communicated. So let's just assume this is a control that a third party is doing on your behalf to some degree, whether they've got half of their responsibility or all of their responsibility. You can use this external inheritance feature to go and select those third parties that have undergone HITRUST assessments and have been tested for this control. and you'll select what level of inheritance you're applying for. So 25%, 50%, 80, 75%, 100%, whatever it may be, based on the shared responsibility model. And that way, whatever their scores are automatically come over to your assessment as your scores. So here, what we've got is we've got an example of what a control looks like that's been scored in compliance. So you'll see policy, procedure, and implement, all three are 100%. The response status is complete. Compliance status is compliant. So this control is compliant with HITRUST requirements. As we go down here, so this is an example of a control that's not applicable. So the scoping factors do a good job of weeding out controls that are not applicable for your system. But occasionally some controls like this PKI-based authentication control will be presented to you, and it may not be applicable. And if it's not, you'll check that box that says NA for not applicable, but you'll have to leave a justification as to why it's not applicable. And again, HITRUST will scrutinize these. They will kick these back and ask for more information in a heartbeat. So just make sure that you work with your assessor firm to make sure that this is written in such a way that appeases HITRUST. All right, here I just wanted to show you that for any control, the control is in the upper left. It shows you what the control language is, but you can see which regulatory factors does it map to. So here you can see it maps to PCI, it maps to NRS, to NIST CSF, to HITRUST, to CRR, and so on and so forth. So this will show you, which of those regulatory factors that this control is in scope for. Moving on now. So this here is just a reminder about scoring. So every control will be assessed based on a maturity level. Every policy, procedure, implement, measured, managed. Each of those will be scored. Each of those maturity levels contribute to the requirement statement or the control score. And so you can either get 0% up to 100%. Most likely it'll be 75% policy, procedure, implement if you just choose to use those three. All of your requirement statements within a domain will be averaged and aggregated to give you a domain score. And that domain score is absolutely the most important. You want to keep an eye and a pulse on that, because for an R2 assessment, your domains have to average a 62 or higher in order to obtain certification. The E1 and I1, your domains need to maintain an 83. All right. Moving on, this is a way for you to be able to identify how you're doing in real time as you progress through the assessment. So in the analytics dashboard within MyCSF, they provide you this overview of the assessment. So this assessment's in pretty good shape. You'll see that the majority of these domains are at 75% or close to, meaning that for the most part, policy, procedure, and implement are scoring at 100%. But then you'll see that one domain near the end, so I guess 19, 18, 17, is at 68%. It's still got some good cushion above the 62, but it's lower than the others. So this dashboard will help you keep a pulse on how your scoring is going, to see if you may be in jeopardy of not being able to obtain certification. So here's our last polling question here. Would you like to speak with a Cherry Bekaert professional about pursuing a HITRUST certification? So yes, no, or maybe later. See if there's any questions. Hopefully so. There we go. Yeah, so would a HITRUST certification be sufficient in lieu of a ROC for PCI compliance? That's a great question. And the answer to that one in particular is no. The ROC is still required. However, a HITRUST certification can be helpful in completion of that report on compliance from a PCI perspective, because as you know, there has to be a PCI DSS assessor who's issuing that ROC, and then HITRUST is not that. So, but it can definitely be be used to help support that process for sure. All right, we've got Polling question answered. Let's see, what are the results here? Okay, they did not come up. Okay, no worries. We will move forward. All right, so on the home stretch here, so corrective action plans being next. So depending on how those controls are scored, that will determine if there's a gap, which we saw an example of that, but it'll also determine if there is a cap that's required, the cap being a corrective action plan. And so HITRUST has this way that it scores things. And so every control is mapped to a control reference. So in that hierarchy from top to bottom, we saw control reference was one of the ways in which the CSF is structured. So if as you look at controls across a given control reference, if the control reference as a whole scores less than has a score less than 71 or say 71, then a cap will be generated for that control. So if there's a gap, which you'll see as you score it, so that first example I did 50, 50, 50, that resulted in a gap. What will determine if a cap is associated is, well, what control reference is that control mapped to? So now let's look, is the combined control reference score across all of those controls that map to it, is it above 71? If it's above 71, then there's no, it's still a gap, but there's no corrective action plan required. But if it falls below that, then you will need to provide a corrective action plan. And this is where you will do that. You will basically put a target remediation date and what your corrective action is. And so HITRUST reviews these. They will scrutinize those. So make sure that the dates are realistic, the corrective action that you're going to pursue is realistic, because if it's not, they'll push it back and you won't be able to move forward with the process until you appease them. So just make sure that you pay careful attention to those and not just try to check a box with them. All right, so then lastly, after we've gone through the scoring process, one of the last things that we'll do before we submit the assessment to HITRUST are all of these administrative and closing tasks. So there's a couple of agreements that you as the assessed entity will need to complete, which is the validated report agreement, the representation letter. And then from an assessor perspective, there's a handful of things that we will have to do as well. We'll have to make sure that it's undergone QA through those certified QA professionals within our firm, that we have the timesheet in order, and just a variety of tasks that are associated with the assessment. We need to make sure all of that information is within the assessment object before we submit to HITRUST. So we want to leave ample time at the end to make sure that we're able to do all of those things. Then once we've submitted to HITRUST, we'll wait for that HITRUST reservation process to begin, and it'll last a handful of weeks, really just depending upon HITRUST workload and really how well done the assessment is. But here's some things that HITRUST is going to look for. They're going to look at the scope. They're going to make sure that it seems reasonable, that any exclusions seem reasonable, and they'll push back whenever they don't think that's the case. They're going to look at all of your requirement statements that you marked as not applicable. They're going to make sure that those rationales are legitimate. They're going to look at all your caps again to make sure that you put realistic dates and expectations for those. But then they're going to randomly select one requirement statement from each domain. So they're going to look at 19 controls and essentially reperform that testing to make sure that it's done in accordance with their standards. And so what you can expect during this process is expect follow-ups from QA. I don't know that there has ever been an assessment go through HITRUST QA without any follow-up from QA, which ultimately just tends itself to the rigor of these assessments, that it's not just to check the box. It is an actual assessment that there's multiple sets of eyes on from the assessor's perspective, plus HITRUST to make sure the quality is there. But although there's going to be some questions, your external assessor firm should be able to address most, if not all of those. They should be very trivial things about just appeasing just the nuances of HITRUST and nothing of substance. And so you shouldn't have anything come back to you. And then this will take 6 to 8 weeks, again, just depending upon the HITRUST current queue. But once it goes through the HITRUST QA process, they're going to issue you a draft report. They're going to put a report out there, and it's going to contain all of the scoping information that you completed when you set up the assessment object. It's going to include all of the controls that were in scope, including the scores for those, and a variety of information. And so you just need to go in there and review that draft report to make sure everything seems in order and aligns with your understanding and contains information that you want in there, again, because you're going to hand this report probably to some other organizations as part of your third-party attestation requirements. So you just want to make sure that what's in the report you're comfortable with. You'll approve it. Once you approve it, HITRUST will give you the final report. And this includes any of those third-party or the regulatory factors as well. So if you chose to add additional regulatory factors like NIST and HIPAA and some of the others, there may be some additional reports that come outside of just the standard HITRUST report as well. All right, so last substantive slide here. This is really just hopefully a help in terms of timeline, in terms of what to expect. How long is this going to take you to complete? And one thing that this does not include is a readiness assessment. If you need to go through the readiness assessment, you can probably add 3 to 12 months to this timeline just to make sure that you're ready. But assuming no readiness, the time from selecting an external assessor, going all the way to the process until you get your report in hand, you're looking at probably 4 to 5 months. Again, just depending upon how quick your organization is to provide evidence, to respond to follow-ups, and then how much depth the assessor firm that you're using has in terms of being able to turn this around. So that is it. Hopefully this was helpful and answered a lot of questions that you may have had about HITRUST. I'm available for the next several minutes to address any other questions that may have come up along the way. So feel free to put those in the chat and the QA. And one other thing that I wanted to draw your attention to real quick is that Cherry Bekaert produces a risk and accounting advisory podcast where it includes many different topics in that space. We recently did a podcast on HITRUST basics, and that's out on our website. I think we can drop a link in the chat here below if you want to check that out. But yeah, open to any questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Keith. A lot of great information there. Keith's contact info is on the slide in front of you. Go ahead and jot that down if you do think of anything over the next several weeks. You know who to get in contact with. Thank you so much, Keith. You're getting some reactions from the audience. It was an excellent session and a lot of great details packed into that. So we're going to go ahead and end it. A reminder, CPE certificates will be issued in about a week for everyone attending the session. And for this one, there will be 2 CPE credits as long as the parameters were met. So thank you so much and have a great rest of your Tuesday.